It's June 29, Ukraine Media Center, Ukraine Forum continues speaking about the main things. My name is Svetlana Cheparenko, and now we will be having a discussion entitled Appropriate or Not, How to Prioritize Public Spending During Wartime. I want to introduce our speakers. Dmytro Natalukha, Chair of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine's Economic Development Committee. Anastasia, Radina, Chair of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine Committee on Anti-Corruption Policy. Alla, Basalaieva, Chairwoman of the State Audit Service of Ukraine. Nadiya, Bihun, Deputy Minister of Economy of Ukraine. Oksana, Prodan, Advisor to the Head of the Association of Ukrainian Cities. And Yuri Nikolov, Editor at Наши Гроши, Our Money. So, dear colleagues, we've all heard about those scandals with the public procurements, flex sticks, expensive vehicles, and drums. So now we will be talking about the appropriateness of such public spending during wartime. So the first question will be to Mr. Dmytro, talking about the appropriateness. What are the appropriate items to be procured, and what are the criteria to identify the appropriateness of such procurements? Thank you very much. I think I'm not going to be very original here, because during wartime the priority is the procurement of the arms and weapons, and the defense procurement will be in the first place. That's absolutely natural, absolutely normal. We're saying that one way or another the priority is then given to the meals, then fuel, and generally by the scope of procurement everything is one way or another related to the needs of the armed forces or the civilians, like for example in the case of, I forgot the word, the shelters for the schools, and for the rest of civilians. So under conditions when we have a war going on, where we're waging a war, when the government reacts to the armed aggression of the Russian Federation, the government identifies the priorities of the public spendings, public procurement. That's very organic, that's natural, nothing unexpected about it. And in the priority of needs, we see its reflection in the defense procurement. So first is the security in the front lines, and second is the security in the rear and everything that can ensure such security. So there are no new things that we could see. Yet another thing is that the drones or UAVs or unmanned maritime vehicles, the percentage of public procurements in these items is way less than in case of heavy weapons. However, to push some industries, to stimulate the development of some industries, the government could take some actions to stimulate the manufacturers in those areas if they would have known that there is the defense requirement. They could finance additional research and development for the short and medium term perspective. But I think we will be coming to this shortly. Mr. Dmytro, just to continue asking you, you've just segregated that the first thing is the procurement for the front lines, and the second priority is the security in the rear. So talking about security in the rear, how can we prioritize procurements in this area from say 1 to 10? Look, all the criteria, they are, so to say, evidence-based. The common reason tells us about them, and when it's the common reason that tells you to do something, you cannot disagree with it. You know, the common reason doesn't tell us to buy the drums for the shelters, and it provoked certain discussions, so to say, and scandals. But the fact that shelter needs to exist and that the shelters need water and the mattresses or tatami, say where people can stay comfortably. I mean, if the word comfortable can be applied to the shelters, so that such types of items are justified. But stadiums which cost 150 millions, well, the common reason tells us that it's not the top priority at this time. So I think it's all dictated by the fact that you cannot go against your intuition, even in cases which seem not completely known to us. When you start thinking what you need as a top priority as a civilian to feel protected, this is something that the government spends money on, so there's nothing new. So the next question will be probably to Miss Anna. Obviously we're seeing not all the machinations going on in the public procurement. Something avoids our sight. So where should we look for the most abuse in the public spending? And in continuation of what Mr. Dmytro said, maybe we should trust not our intuition, but rather to arrange the priorities, to readjust the priorities in public spending. Well, I'll tell you a secret. We don't see anything what's going on in the system Prozorro. Such procurements are going on under direct agreements, and I appreciate the input of the Ministry of Economy. They let us to interfere into public spending just yesterday, or like last year actually, because now we implemented the reports on any agreement entered into, so we may state what are the conditions the agreements are entered into, but it's still a not open procedure. The problem is that if we look through the figures within, well, I'm only talking about the procurements with the marked shelters. So there were 22,200 bids for outfitting odd shelters with a total amount of $9.8 billion, and 835 of them only ended up under our monitoring. So more than 22,000 bids were not the bids where we were authorized to monitor and interfere. However, we fulfilled the procedures according to the procedure rules, to the Prozorro rules, and 31 such procurement procedure was violated. So if we put everything through Prozorro electronic bids, we would identify more violations, I think, because under this mark shelter there are things hidden that are not required in the shelters. For example, like the thing with the drums, pans, and vegetable cutting machines. Yet another big problem is that the Treasury makes such payments available if they are marked as for the needs of the shelter with the top priority. So we apply to the Cabinet of Ministers to amend the resolution number 550, which amends the procedures for the operation of the state treasury under wartime to standardize what are the things of that are really required in the shelters. So we have to make the Ministry of or State Emergency Service to identify the list of such things that are required for the shelters, so that only those things that are required are procured for the shelters. So what are the prospects of such work? Well, we all expect some positive developments in this area, so I think that the Ministry of Finance will not wait. The minister is a part of the government. I'm not a part of the government, I'm not a member of the government, but I will take the most active part in developing those amendments. Question to Ms. Anastasia: who should be responsible to make sure that the costs are not spent for some disputable items. So before bringing somebody to liability, we can do more, because liability is when we want to punish somebody for improper use of the budget funds without further use, with clear indicators of corruption, and so on and so forth. There are certain things that we can do ahead so it doesn't happen. So I think that we have to get back to Prozorro system for all the procurements, because we can procure weapons, for example, and maintenance of weapons outside the procedure of Prozorro, but the procurement of uniform and meals should be brought back to Prozorro. For example, the procurement of the eggs at 17 hryvnia that were actually procured at 17 hryvnias per item. So this is the example where we see that as soon as the transparency is gone, such irrational and insolent, I would say, prices emerged. So first thing is priority. That is the first safety. Another safety is when the increased price appears at the level of creation of bid documents. For example, in our committee for anti-corruption policy, we were listening to the members to the report of the anti-corruption department, that there is a big corruption risk in procurement of the meals for the army, because it allows to increase the price somewhere, because it excludes the possibility to add the manufacturer, because nobody manufactures regular and canned foods at the same time. Those are different manufacturers. And continuing this example with manipulations that start even before the bid is announced at Prozorro, the procurement of meals for the army is so complicated, so entangled, the logistics requirements are so complicated that retail businesses cannot even enter into that bid even before its announcement, due to lack of transparency and lack of normal regulation of logistics. Those who may offer a better price cannot enter such bids. So what to do to avoid such situations? We should switch to the specialized procurement agencies, medical, state enterprise medical procurements were saving about 40% comparing to other organizations that had established the bids, because they were approaching the matter professionally. They were establishing competition in the area, in the field, so they could obtain the better price for the quality that the state can receive. So in this defense industry, another procurement agency should be founded, which may not only announce a bid but also formulate terms of reference. And with the example of the army, I could say that this is the approximate menu that I want to be received by this number of servicemen at this geography, and the professional procurer would then make the terms of reference to the set of requirements for the bidders to set the competition. It works in medical procurements, and it should be working in the procurements for the armed forces. The work is underway, and there are certain hopes. If there are no obstacles from the Ministry of Defense, then we will be able to create such an agency in autumn already that would allow us to save government spending and to save government funds, and we will end up in the situation when the budget funds can be used with the higher efficiency. And regarding the punishment, I think that anti-corruption bodies shows that they really work. We see the arrests, We see the detentions not only when the money are already stolen, we see the impediments of the corruption schemes, destruction of the corruption schemes. Well, a lot of things can be done, how to, can be said to reinforce them, but that's a topic of another conversation. So then all the question to Miss Nadiya, all those procurements of drums, they were going through Prozorro, so Prozorro is no safety against machinations. How can we make sure we use Prozorro system more efficiently, and maybe there are other tools on top of those already mentioned to make sure that the public spending is more transparent? Thank you very much. I would like to start with the reasons of those scandals. In my opinion, the reason for those news is that within the last year, part of the year, we were exempt from the obligation to use Prozorro, and a large part of the bidders, they got used to the situation where there is no control, and they accept the war to write off everything. So getting back to Prozorro, year by year we were bringing the procedures back, and in the end of the year 42% of the procedures or 42% of the funds were spent through competition-based procedures, and as of now it's almost 65%. So we see that the bidders, they did not rebuild the processes inside themselves, the processes that they were using before the war. So I agree with Mr. Dmytro that the common reason tells us that many things should not have been done, but the decisions continue to be taken in the way they were taken before the war. So before the war, the drums would not create such a reaction, but this is not the way we can do it now. So from that point of view, Prozorro is not an artificial intelligence who will tell instead of the contractor what to do and what not to do. And the majority of such things, they are happening because some decisions were or were not taken, and we have to rebuild this decision-taking process. We have to learn our lessons, the right lessons, and on the level of the contractors to review the existing approaches. But I think that the fact that the procurements are coming back, we will gradually make sure that the amount of procurement through Prozorro system grows. We will see bigger number of such situations, and the input of the civil society is very important. In this sense, we need to have common sense work using this soft power, but we're in the process of formulating the functions of the procurement as the functions inside organizations. There's a small number of organizations where professional procurer not only fulfills their duties not only during the process of bid, but also in other parts of the process, in other phases. This is what Ms. Anastasia mentioned. The procurement is also about the approach to formulating the strategy, the category strategy, how we study the market. And now that we work with the people who are responsible for procurements in their organizations, we want to make sure that they don't only focus on the bid process, but also see to what extent is it necessary or not. Aren't the requirements too high for the bids? Maybe we may solve that task with the engagement of lesser number of resources. So we have to have these movements inside of the heads of the people, but at the expense of Prozorro and the expense of the fact that due to the fact that we see it till we don't close the eyes in front of the problems. I hope that we will make it, and I hope we will make it as soon as possible. Ms. Nadiya mentioned about some things that should be the responsibility of the local authorities. So the question to Ms. Oksana: what is the priority of such needs? How do we identify how much to spend for the needs of security and defense, and how much to spend on the needs of the, say, local development of local community? Thank you very much. I think that with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the needs were identified by resolution number 550, and it compensated for the absence of Prozorro, because first almost everything was prohibited from being paid, and then some categories were added, and it seemed in the beginning that this resolution 590, it stopped everything unnecessary, something that cannot be used for the defense needs. And the bigger or the more it was updated, people started forgetting in all levels that Prozorro ever existed and that the declarations are needed. We've forgotten about the transparency, about the publicity of the authorities and the funds. And that's the rule that should exist now, that should be in effect now, because 590 resolution is a lot more broad now. It prioritizes some spending, but still the spendings are quite high. And the local authorities are the ones who identify them, and they look for the funds for the armed forces of Ukraine, for the territorial defense forces, the units created in their bases, and the funds which are obtained by the communities and then forwarded to the security and defense forces. And every once in a while the local governments, they start facing problems with paying for the bids which are aimed at the needs of the armed forces of Ukraine, because sometimes we get explanations and interpretations whether the local authorities are or are not authorized to make payments in favor of the armed forces units. But due to the complexity of such payments, it's the volunteer funds that are channeled that way. Another plan in front of the local governments is the internally displaced people. There's a huge layer of tasks which are faced by the local, by the government, by the community governments, because it's the community who should cover all the needs of the internally displaced persons as they move in. And depending on the geography, we have 4 types of territories now after the 24th of July, and depending on whether is the area of active warfare or the rear, or is the community under temporary occupation, but their council continues operating and making spendings for education, for the schools, for example. And this is something that the community council identifies themselves. And before Prozorro resumes its operation, before there is the mandatory declaration of spending is resumed, we have to thank our journalists, because they fulfill the function of all the control bodies. And we have to say that it's not only a post-fact function, it's a preventive thing. Why preventive? Because when there are drums emerging in one place, they are not being procured in other region, for example. So when the problem becomes public, it's the first step to its solution. So what are the problems that we have in the local governments? There are communities who would like to procure something in the centralized way, because the units can buy, for example, the pencils separately, but there is a political person responsible for that who has nothing to do with organization of the bid, of the procurement. So the bigger is the procurement, the better is the choice in terms of quality and amounts, the costs, and the easier is control. And yet another part is the period of procurement, if they are fulfilled under the full procedure. The term of procurement will be from 15 to 30 working days. Today, it's not always possible, not feasible, but possible. So maybe we have some work to do on the level of the parliament, of the Ministry of Economy, to reduce those terms. I don't know if it's possible, but we have this problem now, so we continue working, and we want to make sure that all the spend is, well, there's yet another problem about the shelters in the state budget. There is a special subsidy for the civil population of the civilians, and small communities cannot obtain funds from there for the shelters. They tell it transparently, they need money for the shelters, but they don't receive those funds. Well, it says for the civil protection of population there is this subsidy, but we're not giving it to you. It's about the small community. So this is the problem that we're facing, and it's about the procurement too. But the procurement definitely should be transparent from all the angles. Mr. Yuri is taking the microphone quite correctly. Ms. Oksana has already brought up the issue of importance of the journalism, because the civil society and the journalists are now the controlling agencies in process of procurement. So in your opinion, what is the role of society and journalism in the healthy society we're moving towards? Well, we are the guardian dogs of democracy. We have to bark when we see something different, because if the rats steal our money, no matter whether it will be stolen on the drums or on the shelters, we have no money to spend on the shells. And this is when we will see Russian tanks coming, and we will have only 15 minutes to gather our things and flee. So it's clear about the media personnel. We continue working, but regarding the responsibility, Mr. Dmytro mentioned it quite well in the beginning. First is the common sense, and second, a criterion from me. How do we identify the corruption component? For example, this drums story, I was trying to sort it out. And actually we may accuse the First Lady, Ms. Zelenska, about the feasibility of that procurement. It was not about the shelter, because the Ministry of Finance doesn't let through any security related payments. So when you add the word shelter there, the Treasury starts making the funds available. But for example, the vegetable cutters, they were necessary for the schools under the program of reformation of meals program in the schools. You see something that was happening with the famous cook Klopotenko, and Ms. Zelenska were pushing it. So who's to blame? The regional administrations, they were fulfilling their functions. They were doing what they were supposed to do, and it was related to providing meals for the children in schools. So legal responsibility, well, feasibility is a relative factor. For example, now Zhytomyr decided to make a bid for reparation of the stadium for 140 million. Well, but for 140 million we can buy an army of drones and kill a huge crowd of Katsabs. But what about the Zhytomyr stadium? In this case we're identified what are the prices. Sometimes the prices for construction materials are really increased, so we've unveiled this law enforcement context, and I'm describing this story in Facebook, and in the comments about the practicality, about the experience, they started, oh, come on, you know I'm from Zhytomyr and we need this stadium, right? And I told him that there will be a team of Butkevich, a local billionaire playing in that field. He's got enough billions to make the stadium at his own expense. So this is where we start seeing the priorities for different categories of people. We see the people dancing in the nightclubs, sometimes even the government officials can be noticed there, and is the same country where the volunteers work for the front lines. And I've realized that the matter of experience should not be standardized. It cannot be standardized because if you dig into the depth of this matter with the vegetable cutters, I mean, there should be things that are unacceptable for anybody, because when there is a flag stick for the flag, well, you want to put that government official on that flag stick. Just paint your mayor's office into blue and yellow instead of putting the flag on a flag stick. So this is where I talk about the experience. I'm just feeling sad as a media person about that. This story of the vegetable cutters, they juxtapose the stories of the real corruption. Well, who says about the procurement of the other items at higher prices? So when we sort out those standards for the shelters, which were or about to be held in Kiev, we found some interesting things there. For example, a bench for the shelter. Well, everybody understands what kind of bench it should be. So it's a wooden bench. So it's 7,000 hryvnias. So it's for utility companies, utility institutions for every district. So I've opened the webpage of Epicenter, but what can be procured for 7,000 hryvnias? You can buy a good couch, soft couch where you can sit very comfortably, but on the other hand you can buy a wooden bench for the same price, and it's not a single story, you know. So for me, this matter of experience is being overlapped by a issue of corruption. Well, Mr. Yuri mentioned very cool thing that I'm thinking about too. In the same country, there are really incredible number of volunteers who invest their funds in support of the country, and at the same time there is a different situation. So I think that from the point of view of procurements, for us as the Ministry of Economy, we would like to move into the direction where the people who deal with the procurements should have desire and ability to influence the processes. I don't want them to become the volunteers, but I want them to have the same philosophy of decision making. And in this sense, we support the initiative of our colleagues from the association. We need to move in the pathway of centralization of local budgets. This is when you will be able to get a team of motivated people who will be interested in fulfilling interesting projects, and they will be able to influence what's going on, the processes that are going on. But you know, even the corruption can be centralized in this sense, but my colleagues may support me that when now we have 27,000 contractors all around the country, it's sometimes difficult to control them, both for journalists and everyone else. And if we walk the way of decentralization, there will be less subjects and the attention to them will be higher. It will help to centralize not corruption, but centralize the efficiency. If anybody has anything to add, please go ahead. If not, we may proceed to the Q&A session. It's just an interesting statement. Me and Miss Anastasia, we have to think about the responsibility, because if we take the example of Mr. Yuri, we may go all the way up to the accusing of United Nations organization, because the because, for example, the program of the First Lady is developed in compliance with the recommendations of the World Food Program, which is a part of the United Nations, and those vegetable cutters were bought upon their recommendation, basically. So it's an original way to see that, it's an original angle, but we have to find somebody who is really responsible. If we open this Pandora's box, because somebody decided to do it, to open that Pandora box and put those drums and vegetable cutters there. So this is a real important question. Ms. Oksana wanted to add something. Thank you once again. So talking about those vegetable cutters, what Mr. Yuri said, there is the resolution 590. It says about the priorities, priority 1, 2, and 3. So one of the officials counterfeited the payment order, adding the word shelter there. So if it would be done according to the law without the word shelter, the treasury would not have let those vegetable cutters through. So it's not a matter of priority, but it's about the specific person that obfuscated somebody. And there is yet another part. So if it was not for publicity in that procurement, they would pass and we would not see any publicity about it. So what is the responsibility for counterfeiting documents and who was brought to such liability? Well, there is criminal liability for counterfeiting documents. And getting back to the vegetable cutters, the implementation of the First Lady program can be done even without such an expensive vegetable cutter. And I think it already this program already works for 2 years. It has started 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And the procurement of the costly equipment, even without vegetable slicers, is a good example of how efficient is the approach of centralized procurement organizations. For example, the state enterprise medical procurements, they procure costly medical equipment, tomographs, magnetic tomography machines, and they make it at lower prices, way cheaper than in the on the centralized level. And sometimes they can, they have some requirements set there specifically. For example, that CAT machine has to work with the load of the stripe more than 250 kilograms, and there is a disclaimer, there is only one company manufacturing such machines, and it results in the fact that the equipment is being procured at way higher price. And the proper way is the establishment, founding of such procurement organizations, procurement agencies, and they will work in a way that we will receive cheaper prices. Well, decentralization, when we talk about the association of the cities, when we talk about the procurements, it should be voluntary, both on the level of local community and on the level of other industry. And this is when the society will push all the contractors to go that way. If it's a monopolistic organization, if it works efficiently, it will probably result in corruption immediately, because if there is other option, I will react right away if I agree with the voluntarity. But for example, I'm a representative of local government. I'm a client, so for me it would be cheaper if the procurement agency does it for me and I have money left to do more for the hospital, for example. So based on the faithfulness, if we base ourselves on the faithfulness, it's in their best interest, because when we see this requirement of the CAT machine stripe to hold 250 kilograms, it's like when you say that you need a vehicle to drive around the city, but it should be armed as a tank. It doesn't look rational. It looks like something that behind which is a kickback, when you have already agreed with the potential suppliers. So now our conversation had transformed into a discussion. Well, centralization, I think it's possible within the last 5 to 6 years, because in the legislation there is such a possibility. Plus, within the last couple of years, we have Prozorro market tool operating. It's a market where you can quickly buy within 2 days. For example, within 2 days to make a procurement according to a number of categories, because this is how we started with the full-scale invasion. There is no time for open bid. There is a 7-day procedure, but sometimes we don't even have 7 days, and Prozorro market is very well developed in this sense. This gas, medical supplies, meals, medicines, and other medical equipment. And we see, for example, that really there is no voluntary use of it. We have about only 15% of the clients who use Prozorro market on a regular basis. And talking about the school lunches, many clients there use Prozorro market, and we help in reforming the school meals, because they have the opportunity to buy the meals efficiently and quickly. But other clients, they need some additional stimulus, so they feel their benefits. Well, probably we had a number of events held, and I think they are never enough. I think we have to do more and more of them, but all in all, I think that without the pressure, without the soft power, and maybe a little bit of hard power, we will have no movement towards raising clients' interests in giving their procurements away to some centralized organizations, even if it's more efficient to them. So even in case of medicines, we have good examples. There are amendments prepared for that contemplate some categories of the medicines to be procured under different procedure, because we see that it can be bought in Prozorro market at 15 to 20% cheaper and quicker, but the hospitals choose it other way, and there is no explanation. Well, this hard power and soft power explanation can be explained by the procurement nannies and procurement educators. So this is the story that we are about to have. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions to the panelists? Vladislav Obuhu, current form, can you please tell us what is the place for the needs of the infrastructure in this system? Is it different, or is it the same as for other government procurements, and how it will be prioritized? What can be and what should be done first thing, and what can be postponed until victory? Well, for the time being, there is no specific procedure for the needs of procurement for the needs of recovery. When we say that we have some construction within the recovery program, there is a universal procedure, open bids with specificities. It's the competitive procedure through Prozorro, and according to the resolution in effect, which contemplates the grounds for the direct agreements, as Ms. Alla mentioned, there were more reasons before, but now such justifications for the direct agreements is reduced like urgent need. For example, in Kherson, we understand the consequences of the terroristic act in Kakhovka Dam are horrible, and people have to have their basic needs covered, and we don't have even a couple of days for this procurement. So there it is allowed to procure things under urgent procedure. Yet another thing is security and defense. If there is a proper justification that is for the needs of defense and security, it can be made outside the procedures, beyond the procedures. So we expect that the recovery reconstruction will be going on through Prozorro under normal procedures, where the direct agreements arise. The State Audit Service has the right to audit them, to monitor them, and I think it's very important, including as a signal for the clients. If they try to avoid it, they will even draw more attention to themselves from the attention of the State Audit Service, because everybody understands that if you want to talk to State Audit Service, maybe the best way is to go into direct agreement, and you are most likely to be asked some questions. So the matter of recovery, it's very important in the Ukrainian society. Us as a State Audit Service, we're the main body which is identified by the IMF as the main body which controls the matter of reconstruction and recovery. So our task, all of ours, we step up with the initiative of legislative amendments, but I will ask the parliament, I want to meet the representatives of every parliamentary fraction. We need to have our control transparent. We cannot afford losing the trust of international partners. And they say the same thing. We will give you the money provided the proper financial control, provided compliance and monitoring. So the monitoring of procurement is the only thing. Monitoring of procurements, control of procurements, audit and revisions. So this is one and only preventive measure. We cannot afford spending a budget hryvnias in excess. We understand that we will spend the money even on Ukrainian taxpayers. So this is why we have to be very responsible. One of such steps that we see is the ban for the Treasury to make the funds available, and it will be the first time in the legislation when it will identify what violations are substantial. It's only initiative. So if we identify substantial violations, we will cover it in the system of Prozorro, and it will be indicator for the Treasury not to make funds available. Because what's going on now? The funds are disbursed and they are being spent in a week. So when we come to our audits and revisions, we will document that the money was spent inefficiently, but they're gone. Obviously, we will report to the law enforcement agencies. Someone will be sitting in Vienna with a notice of suspicion in the pocket, but I want to talk to every people's deputy with this initiative that we are about to step up. We want to hear, like, if you want, make it temporary for the time of reconstruction, set up some time limits, but it's necessary to make sure we rebuild in an effective way. What I wanted to add, the last part of your question about the priority of industries during reconstruction and the priority sectors in this context, very important is the adoption of the law on localization, which is in fact a tool of stimulating of the priority industries, because it helps redistribute budget funds that are channeled for procurement, specifically for those sectors that are identified as the priority by the government, not some priority companies, but the priority industries like machine construction or defense and security. That's the state policy, and in this context, according to the same practice, we may understand during the process of recovery what are the industries in Ukraine that may play a key role and they can be stimulated in the proper way, but the fact that we cannot cover to the full extent or during certain period, we may exchange it. We may say that okay, this is what we import, but this industry, it has a multiplier effect, it employs a lot of people, and we will stimulate it with the government procurement, and this is how we push them to development. Thank you, dear colleagues. Do we have any more questions? Oh, well, if I may, a small comment to what Ms. Alla said. Yeah, we also support the necessity to increase control. There is the demand for justice in the society, and every such scandal will be very loud, specifically when we're saying about the big clients who make procurement on the government level and the state level. For example, the scandals in the Ministry of Defense, they're very sensitive. Many people laid their lives, but at the same time, some may abuse certain things. This is why we support the reinforcement of control, but we think that this mechanism should be set up in a way, I'm talking about the payment blocking or payment suspension, it should be consciously restricted, consciously limited, because we see the control of procurements during previous periods, most attention, most focus was on the formal violations, not something that directly influences the economic effect, but rather something that people, for example, made some error or they were not able to do something in time. It's very important for suspension of the payment in terms of such non-intentional errors, some formal errors, because the state procurements are about the needs of the state, of the countries. So we took a lot of effort to get back to Prozorro procedures, so they comply with the law in a competitive way during wartime. And I think that during reconstruction, people will demand us to have the results promptly. So we definitely support it. We need to reinforce the procurements, but we need to find the mechanism where the money can be suspended in case they can be stolen or spent in unnecessary items or on something that may raise concerns with the society, but rather than in cases where we have some formal errors, some formal violations, and people may die without that, or it's otherwise necessary. So we continue working with our colleagues. We have a set of proposals, and I hope that my colleagues will be able to process this number of proposals, and we will be able to both reinforce control, and at the same time it will become a powerful strike, powerful hit against corruption, against procurements that are not really necessary. I want to add, just ensure that whether those violations are formal or not, the audit service is the body that exercises control within legislation adopted by the Ministry of Economy as a body which formulates the strategy for public procurements. If they set the requirements to be complied with by the client, we control whether those requirements are fulfilled. This is the law, no matter whether it's formal or non-formal requirements. So as to our initiative, it was us who were the first to step up to identify what are the substantial violations, and it all hurts all of us. We have to stand shoulder to shoulder with one another to make sure that the budget funds are spent efficiently. So yes, only about this substantiality of the violations, heroes, and we are ready to talk about that with all the interested committees. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this comprehensive discussion. I hope that you will become an impetus which will drive us to the transparent public spending. And I'm reminding you, we've just been talking about the experience of the public spending. Ukraine Media Center will continue working tomorrow, so see you tomorrow, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.